Final Fantasy IX arrived at an interesting time for the franchise. The two previous games had collectively sold just shy of 20 million copies worldwide between them, and this not only eclipsed the combined sales of Final Fantasy 1 through 6, but it also signified a massive switch in their audience. Almost overnight, Final Fantasy went from a franchise that saw its global sales primarily fueled by Japan, to one where that same Japanese audience now accounted for less than 50% of those global sales. There was also an influx of new fans who were perhaps aware of what Square had achieved throughout the 8-bit and 16-bit era, while others were completely ignorant to what had come before. Hironobu Sakaguchi, who had been pivotal to the franchise's growth throughout the first 6 installments, was very aware of this, and as he hadn't been anywhere near as involved in Final Fantasy 7 or 8, decided to work with Hiroyuki Ito and a collection of other creators from the so-called olden days to make something that was designed for those fans who had been left behind. Throughout this video, we're going to run through 21 delightful pieces of information about Final Fantasy IX in our typical granular style. They will cover unique aspects of its development, quirky or broken in-game mechanics, lesser-known lore details, and its unorthodox impact on wider popular culture. So with that, strap yourselves in, as our first piece of information relates to indecision about what kind of game Final Fantasy IX was even going to be. In early 1999, not long after Final Fantasy VIII had been shipped in Japan, a publication called the Gaming Intelligence Agency received word from a trusted insider that they had seen early videos of a brand new Final Fantasy game. Not only that, they had come into possession of design documents that were supposedly labelled as Final Fantasy IX. Their insider spoke about how the game was planned to break away from the more realistic style presented within Final Fantasy 7 and 8, and would therefore feature super deformed characters that resembled hobbits. They also said that the game was planned to feel much closer to the 8-bit and 16-bit games, and would feature characters and locations that served as strong allusions to that era. But even though this description all sounded very in tune with what we saw within the final product, within the aforementioned design documents, what was shown was almost unrecognisable. There were initial designs for numerous jobs, some of which, like Vikings and witches, had seldom been used before within the franchise. 2 characters called Bahamut Dragoon and Leviathan Dragoon were also present, as were early concepts for Black Mages and Burmesian Dragoons. Such was the significance of this stylistic departure from the 2 previous games that for a long time, senior figures at Square, including Sakaguchi himself, were unsure about whether the game should even be called Final Fantasy IX. When speaking with Next Generation Online on the 17th of May 1999, Shinji Hashimoto even commented on the potential of a Final Fantasy IX game, saying whether it will be called Final Fantasy IX or not is yet to be decided. At Squaresoft, we are always looking to come up with cutting-edge storylines and systems. Whether that new storyline will be Final Fantasy IX has not yet been decided. This quote and the leak from the GIA led to a lot of speculation and uncertainty. There were those who felt Square just wouldn't go ahead with such a bold move given how successful Final Fantasy 7 and 8 had been. It led to suggestions that the leak could pertain to something else. One potential was Final Fantasy Tactics 2. While another was that it was some kind of new spin-off, similar to what Final Fantasy Tactics had been itself 2 years prior. Another suggestion was that the game highlighted in the leak could even be a hard reboot for the original game. For whatever reason though, many of the concepts found within the leaked design documents were shelved or reworked. This then made the game fit more in line with what had been seen in previous years, and this ultimately meant the team felt more comfortable calling it Final Fantasy IX when it was officially unveiled at the Square Millennium event. Throughout this process of refinement, numerous sources of inspiration were considered, as well as the ultimate approach. In the end, Sakaguchi decided that unlike Final Fantasy 7, 8, and indeed The Spirits Within, Final Fantasy IX should have a stronger focus on fantasy. But this notion wasn't intended to focus on just game design elements. Instead, the plan was to have the entire game embody this ideal, including the narrative themes, the visuals, and the music. And given how the franchise had grown, and how much Final Fantasy 7 and 8 had resonated with fans, this represented a huge risk. Regardless, Sakaguchi felt it was a necessary risk, because he wanted to keep things fresh while also catering to their older fans. There was a general feeling that if they kept showing the same style of game, audiences would just get bored, and that's why they decided to create characters like Vivi, as he not only had a design that was a direct homage to the famous Black Maid's job, but also, through significant advances in modern technology, they could create cartoony-looking characters that still retained a degree of realism. It wasn't necessarily something they had a great deal of experience with though, so the art team studied the works of Jim Henson and Frank Oz. Both had become incredibly famous due to their puppetry work, with Sesame Street becoming a global phenomenon, as well as the Muppets. They had an amazing ability to bring these fictional characters to life, but it was when they created the Dark Crystal that they showed this approach could be used to create something compelling that incorporated healthy narrative themes while targeting an older audience. And as revealed by Toshiyuki Itahana, who was a character designer on the original game working under Hideo Manaba, it was this movie that ended up having a direct influence on the visual style adopted in Final Fantasy IX. If you love learning details like this though, then we're confident that you'd love our new YouTube channel called Datalog. It's been set up with a simple mission statement to chronicle the development histories of Japanese-made role-playing games. If that sounds of interest, then there's a link in the description below. Now, throughout the development of Final Fantasy IX, the team wanted to create a host of powerful and unique characters, each with their own motivations. Vivi was just one such example, introduced right at the beginning of the game. But another character was the imposing General Beatrix, a cold, callous, militaristic character who followed the orders of her superiors without question. Players had the chance to square off against her numerous times throughout the game, with each encounter teaching a valuable lesson as to why her combat prowess was known across the land. And these elements, combined with the moment that Beatrix had her eyes opened, helped to cement her as a very memorable character. But according to earlier drafts of the game, the role of General Beatrix was planned to be very different. Over a decade ago, Sakaguchi published some of Final Fantasy IX's planning notes online. This was something he often did as a way of connecting with the Mistwalker audience. But in one particular post, he shared earlier drafts of Final Fantasy IX's opening sequence, as he felt there were parallels with another of his games called The Last Story. What we saw in these documents was that the initial story followed a similar path to what was found in the final game. It revolved around Zidane meeting Garnet for the first time and then fleeing from the palace. But there was one key difference. There was no General Beatrix. Instead, Steiner appeared alongside Queen Bran, alone. As revisions took place, it was decided that the character of Steiner, who was planned to be a noble paladin who commanded the Alexandrian army, should be split down the middle, with Beatrix obtaining most of the positive traits and Steiner receiving most of the negative ones. It saw Beatrix given the noble reputation as a feared soldier, and she was positioned as the general of the Alexandrian Empire. Beatrix also took Steiner's paladin job, as well as the typical redemption arc associated with characters who had previously adorned that job. Steiner was instead made a knight, and his more noble personality traits such as chivalry were accentuated to the point of being comedic, and his competency as a knight was downplayed. But he did still command a small troop of soldiers called the Knights of Pluto, but they provided no real utility to the Alexandrian army and were often seen as being inept to the point that they were just humorous. Despite this, Steiner remained a prominent member of the playable cast, whereas Beatrix was made an antagonist. But one shared trait remained. Both had steadfast loyalty to Garnet. Garnet herself was made into a fascinating character as development progressed, with some powerful narrative exposition associated with her. But one of the most curious aspects related to her past. As the story developed, players learned that even though Garnet was designated as the Princess of Alexandria, she was not the real daughter of Queen Bran. Indeed, the real Princess Garnet had passed away when she was only 6 years old, and it left both Bran and her husband distraught. It just so happened, though, that around the same time, Madain Sori had been attacked, and the mother and daughter had managed to escape on a boat. In terms of the story, the mother unfortunately perished during the escape, but the daughter, who was the same age as Garnet, was found by Dr. Tot, and he immediately noticed that she bore a striking resemblance to the recently deceased princess. Garnet's summoner horn was then removed, and they convinced both the girl and the people of Alexandria that she was the real Princess of Alexandria, as it appeared to suit all parties. It was a rather interesting plot detail, but there was an obscure twist, as this story arc had a direct connection with the original Final Fantasy due to the real names of both the mother and the daughter, which were Jane, an ode to Queen Jane, and Sarah, an ode to Princess Sarah. These names were not proactively shared throughout the story, and could only be found if a specific set of actions were taken. On Disc 4, the player needed to form a party with Garnet in and visit Lanny standing at Iko's back porch in Madain Sari. Upon arriving, Lanny would run away, prompting the player to exit the village and return, but only if Garnet and Amarant were not present. Lanny then needed to be spoken to twice before heading to the eidolon wall and walking clockwise from the entrance. If a chime was then heard, the party then had to walk counterclockwise back to the entrance before repeating this action 9 times. If done correctly, the murals could then be read to discover messages from Garnet's father addressing both Jane and their daughter Sarah. Given that one of the core themes of Final Fantasy IX was reflection, the game was rammed full of allusions to the franchise's illustrious past, as shown by the real name of Princess Garnet and her mother. But plenty of other allusions were introduced that related to other properties as well. Many of these were front and centre, like the Buster Sword appearing, or the inclusion of dialogue from Star Wars. But one niche reference was hidden right in plain sight, and it was a tribute to one of the first games Sakaguchi ever worked on, Cruise Chaser Blasty. This was a science fiction role-playing game released back in 1986, and in addition to Sakaguchi, it also featured work by Nobuo Uematsu and Kazuhiko Aoki, both of whom returned to work on Final Fantasy IX. Central to the game was the use of mecha, and one of them was called the SPEX-07 Blasty, a prototype mecha that could transform. To pay homage to their earlier works, the developers created an eidolon called Arc. Unlike many of the other eidolons featured in the game, Arc was of Terran origin, and was also very difficult to obtain. As such, it was the most powerful eidolon in the game, and it was given the ability to transform, like the Blasty mecha. And if you put the images side by side, you can see the clear reference to the past. Arc being of Terran origin was a fascinating lore detail, and it played into numerous wider details relating to the eidolons themselves and how they were born. After an incident with Alexander, the summoners were forced to leave the Mist Continent, and they settled in Madain Sari due to its connection with the planet. Here, they dedicated much of their time to understanding eidolons and how they could not only be summoned, but controlled. Through their research, they learned that eidolons were connected with the planet, born via its crystal as guardians from the accumulation of memories from the souls within. But these memories were also what helped to determine how the eidolons manifested. This was used to explain why eidolons all have such unique visual styles, and how the same eidolon can even change its appearance. This is, for example, why Shiva was described in the older legends as being a small pixie, whereas in the present day, when summoned by the party, she manifests as a grown woman. This was a neat piece of lore, but it also served as a reference to those leaked design documents we mentioned earlier in the video, as within, they showed Shiva as a small pixie. But even though the summoners learnt all of this, they knew little of Garland's wider plan. Also armed with the same knowledge, Garland saw the summoners as his biggest threat to conquest, as the eidolons created by Gaia's crystal, in theory, were much more powerful and plentiful than the eidolons created by Terra's dying crystal. It was for this reason that he ordered Kuja to destroy Madain Sari. Now, even though Final Fantasy IX was rammed full of illusions, not all of them manifested as intended. In Disc 3, the party confronted 4 elemental shrine guardians in their endeavours to reach Terra. These were a clear reference back to the 4 Fiends concept, but of the 4 guardians, only the Earth Guardian was faced as a boss, with the rest of them defeated off-screen. It wasn't always planned this way though. Data hacking revealed codes that strongly implied plans for battles against all 4 Shrine Guardians as opposed to just the one. Further investigation into the code also suggested that these fights were intended to happen, not once, but twice. And this made sense, as in the original Final Fantasy, they were fought against multiple times. Concept artwork for each representative Shrine Guardian, as well as the locations where they were likely to have been encountered, were also created. It's unknown why these plans were discarded. In hindsight, it could have been due to time constraints, as this would have theoretically required adding 7 more boss battles to the game, or it could have just been to ensure better pacing. Either way, battles with the Guardians of Terra, or Chaos Guardians, did still take place much later. Though they weren't exactly the same, these entities were created from the crystal's memories of the Shrine Guardians, and this time they were directly named after the 4 Fiends. Despite oddities like this still existing though, when Final Fantasy IX did launch, it was more refined game data-wise than any of its predecessors. But there still did exist some code within the game that revealed its own small collection of unused concepts and content, like of course the addition of the Shrine Guardian fights. Perhaps one of the better known cuts would have been the balloon collecting minigame featuring Vivi. but many were more obscure. Some of these included a menu portrait and victory pose for Sinner, some unused location backgrounds in places like Limblom, extra Moogle menu options, and a game over title for Disc 4 that cryptically relayed the message of Gaia's destruction to players. Amongst these was a scrapped segment that occurred early on in the story when the Prima Vista airship crashed in the Evil Forest. After discovering Princess Garnet had gone missing, Zidane insisted on finding her before leaving the forest, but was met with opposition from Baku. The original continuity saw Zidane battle against Baku before leaving Tantalus to go after Garnet. But in the unused segment, Zidane could opt to choose to listen to Baku. If this choice was selected, players then received a cutscene with Zidane and Vivi sleeping, but the former's concern for Garnet haunted him throughout the night. Coming full circle and moving away from development intricacies, in an official sense, Final Fantasy IX was announced right at the start of the year 2000 alongside Final Fantasy X and XI. These announcements took place at an exclusive event hosted by Square in Japan called the Square Millennium Event, and over 10,000 lucky fans were in attendance. Such was the magnitude of the event, Square kept delaying it, as they feared the announcements, many of which related to games being developed for the PlayStation 2, would have a detrimental impact on the sales of their already released properties or those with impending releases. Nonetheless, the event was an amazing spectacle, and of the 3 Final Fantasy games announced, Final Fantasy IX was positioned as a swan song for the franchise on the original PlayStation, there to pay tribute to everything that had come before. Not only that, Square revealed that fans wouldn't have to wait long until they could play it, as the release date was during the summer of that year in Japan. But what many people had forgotten was that despite all of the bluster, Final Fantasy IX had already been announced many years prior, and weirdly enough, it was even announced before Final Fantasy VIII. Around the time that Final Fantasy VII was released in Japan, Square had just opened up their 3rd operation in North America under the umbrella of Square USA. Called Square Pictures, it was established in Hawaii, the perfect go-between for Japan and Los Angeles. Opening up Square Pictures was a significant undertaking though. The new studio cost a reported $45 million to construct, and Square wanted to make use of that investment as soon as possible. They also wanted to make sure those external to the company understood its purpose too, as a way of justifying the expense and showcasing their credentials. So on the 8th of April 1997, less than 3 months after Final Fantasy VII had shipped in Japan, Square revealed to the world, according to a report by Madman's Cafe, their work had already commenced on Final Fantasy IX, not Final Fantasy VIII. This felt kind of backwards, but it wasn't the first time it had happened. Square also infamously announced Final Fantasy V for the Super Famicom before Final Fantasy IV for the Famicom, as they wanted people to get excited about the next generation of hardware. But then they decided to cancel Final Fantasy IV and rebrand V as 4. This time it was done because Final Fantasy VIII was to be developed in Japan by the same team who had just shipped Final Fantasy VII. But development of Final Fantasy IX was to take place almost entirely at this new studio in Hawaii, and Sakaguchi was even moving to Hawaii to oversee everything. Details at this point were naturally limited, but what Square did share was that one of the primary reasons for this move was that they intended to create a game that had a more CG movie look and feel, and to do that, they needed to make use of the talents on offer in their Hawaii studio. True to their vision, the decision to have Final Fantasy IX be developed in Hawaii opened up quite a few doors for Square, and one of the main benefits was that some of the old guard Final Fantasy creators who had been at Square since the early days got the opportunity to work with new blood from relatively diverse backgrounds. Sakaguchi had moved to Hawaii with the aim of establishing a foothold for Square in North America, but he wasn't alone. Prominent Japanese employees such as Uematsu also temporarily relocated to the United States. But the main knock-on effect was that this decision afforded opportunities for foreign talent to join the development team, something that, outside of the legendary Nasir Jebeli, was almost unheard of. Many of these individuals were fresh into the industry, used to assist with the creation of graphical assets. But what's amazing is that the majority of them went on to work on some of the biggest properties in entertainment following the release of Final Fantasy IX. Brian Beppu, for example, worked on field map graphics, but after Final Fantasy IX, he joined Midway and then Naughty Dog, where he worked as a texture artist on Uncharted 2 and 3, as well as The Last of Us, before working as an environmental artist on Uncharted 4 and The Last of Us Part 2. He has since left Naughty Dog to join Lightspeed LA, where he's contributing to their upcoming game, The Last Sentinel, as principal environmental artist. Francisco Cortina worked on Final Fantasy IX after helping out on Parasite Eve, another game that was developed in Hawaii. But after leaving Square, he set up a consultancy firm and was hired to work on games like Heavy Rain, Call of Duty, Red Faction Armageddon, and Killzone 3. They now work at Epic Games as a principal character artist. In terms of other video games the alumni have worked on, Wesley Kahn recently worked as an environmental artist on Mass Effect Andromeda. Veronique Garcia ended up at Visceral Games where she contributed to the Dead Space franchise. Paul Moyer also worked on Uncharted 1, 2 and 3 before joining Double Fine, and Christian Laurent Schurer ended up working with Sakaguchi again on Lost Odyssey. The list goes on though, as plenty of people also transitioned over to TV and film, working on properties like the Matrix franchise, Puss in Boots and Troll Hunters, as well as numerous Marvel TV shows produced by Netflix. In short, even though the pool of foreigners working on Final Fantasy IX was still relatively small, when Square USA imploded following The Spirits Within, the vast majority opted to leave, and they ended up working on some pretty significant entertainment properties. The Western development footprint on Final Fantasy IX didn't just relate to internal hires though. By this point in his career, even though Sakaguchi was still very interested in video game development, he was also interested in film. It's why he pushed so hard for Square to branch out, and it led to the creation of Square Visual Works and Square Sounds, which focused purely on the production of CG animation and music and sound effects. But even though Square was able to hire some very talented people, and the knowledge they gained on The Spirits Within could be leveraged by the team working on Final Fantasy IX and beyond, there was also an appreciation that it was beneficial for them to work with some third parties who were much more established and experienced. After conducting an extensive search, it led to Square partnering with a French company called Ex Machina. Having been founded in 1989, Ex Machina had spent over a decade honing their skills with animation, cinema, and video games. It had seen them work on properties such as La Planète de Donkey Kong, which reused assets from the Donkey Kong Country animated series to create interstitials that played between shows. But they also worked on Star Siege, James and the Giant Peach, and even Star Trek The Experience, The Klingon Encounter. After the completion of Final Fantasy IX, Ex Machina were then hired to continue working on Square to make sure the game was as good as it can be. But to ensure no stone was left unturned, they also hired Skywalker Sound. Established by George Lucas, Skywalker Sound had worked on many Hollywood productions. Final Fantasy IX represented, to our knowledge at least, the first video game they had ever worked on. But it wasn't the first time they had worked with a Japanese company, as Skywalker Sound had contributed to the JoJo's Bizarre Adventure OVA. After Final Fantasy IX, they also worked on The Spirits Within, as well as a whole host of other video games, including but not limited to Uncharted, Metal Gear Solid 4, StarCraft 2, and Halo 2. Because of all of this, production value was at its peak with Final Fantasy IX, and to ensure everything meshed well, Uematsu was given a monumental task that was quite different from every previous game he'd worked on, Final Fantasy or otherwise. The Final Fantasy IX soundtrack contained more tracks than any other game in the franchise, and not by a small margin. The previous record was held by Final Fantasy VII, which featured 85 tracks. By comparison, Final Fantasy IX had 110 separate tracks featured on the commercially released album, and a further 42 were then released on a second album called Final Fantasy IX Plus. What's ironic is that at the start of production, Hiroyuki Ito had told Uematsu that it'd be fine if you composed tracks for the 8 characters, an exciting battle track, a gloomy, dark evoking piece, and around 10 or so other tracks. Based on his experience though, Uematsu knew the game was likely to require a few more, and it's for that reason that he decided to temporarily relocate to Hawaii so he could become more integrated with the development team. But even though this was all done with the intention of committing wholeheartedly to the project, being based in Hawaii failed to inspire Uematsu's creative juices, as the architecture was not even remotely medieval in nature, and as that was the main style of the game, it created a problem that meant he made limited progress. To help clear his mind, Uematsu requested a break from production. He chose to venture to Europe, and while there he visited numerous castles and soaked in the architecture and atmosphere. When he returned, Uematsu ended up becoming consumed by the project due to how much creative freedom he was afforded. It saw Uematsu work more than 12 hours almost every day, as he'd come into the studio around 10 AM and often leave after 11 PM. It was extreme, but what's even more extreme is that Uematsu kept up this work schedule religiously for just under a year. It was only once the project finished that he dialed things down and then felt a sense of emptiness as he'd been so absorbed in his work, something that made him reflect on his future and whether he'd ever want to do anything like that ever again. Outside of the volume, one of the other major aspects changed with the Final Fantasy IX soundtrack was the use of music to accompany cinematic sequences. While previous games had featured a handful of custom tracks to accompany pivotal scenes, that notion was amplified this time around, and it meant a lot of music was produced that was only ever going to be heard once. It was a big undertaking, but Uematsu felt this approach, when combined with the higher quality of audio sampling available due to significant advancements in the field, allowed him to better craft music that told stories. This was why so many pieces were created that featured similar melodic and harmonic sequences. But even though the core themes were often the same, Uematsu wanted to ensure there were always subtle differences, and he used them to highlight narrative changes to the player that had happened since they had heard the previous version. Perhaps the best example of this comes with the music associated with Kuja. Track 19 on Disc 2, sometimes known as Immoral Melody, played when Kuja was seen at the auction house in Treno. It was then used again during the sequence when the party spotted Kuja on the silver dragon at the Aether Tree. The piece itself was based on Kuja's theme, but to add depth, it featured a pipe organ during its introduction as well as heavy percussion. Track 12 on Disc 4, often referred to as Dark Messenger, had a nearly identical start, featuring a pipe organ playing the same melodic sequence. But there was a crucial difference, as Uematsu did not use the same pipe organ. For the latter piece, Uematsu instead used a much richer sounding sample, and this was done to convey the altered emotional state of Kuja following the passage of time between the encounter at the Aether Tree and then within Terra. When you listen to the two pieces back to back, it's a very noticeable difference, and it's a testament to the lengths Uematsu went to ensure his music enriched the experience and helped players to become more emotionally invested. Amongst the veterans working on Final Fantasy IX, perhaps the most notable outside of Sakaguchi and Uematsu was Hiroyuki Ito. Ito had worked on Final Fantasy games throughout the 8-bit era as a member of the support staff, but it was during the 16-bit era that his talents came to the fore. He was one of the driving forces behind the ATB system, before then overseeing the creation of Final Fantasy V's comprehensive job system, and then serving as co-director on Final Fantasy VI, a role he shared with Yoshinori Kitase, while Sakaguchi oversaw them both as producer. On Final Fantasy IX, Ito and Sakaguchi fulfilled the same roles again, except this time Ito was promoted to sole director. And together, they set out to tell a compelling story that was supported by stunning visuals, optimized gameplay mechanics, and of course, high-quality music. Ito's role, however, was rather encompassing. As opposed to Final Fantasy VI, where he was responsible for the gameplay elements, he was now responsible for everything, including the game's vocal theme, Melodies of Life. Final Fantasy VIII became the first game to feature a vocal theme, with Eyes on Me melting hearts around the world, thanks to its combination of Uematsu's compositional genius and the voice of Fei Wong. But another crucial aspect was the lyrics, which in that instance were written by Kako Sameya, who Uematsu had worked with on the Final Fantasy IV Celtic Moon arrangement album many years prior. For Final Fantasy IX, Uematsu composed Melodies of Life, with Emiko Shiratori providing the vocals. But instead of hiring a professional musician or lyricist to come up with the lyrics, they were instead penned by Hiroyuki Ito. Except, instead of being credited with his actual name, Ito chose to instead use an alias, Xiaomi. What's even more interesting is that this alias has continued to be used on soundtrack credits related to Final Fantasy IX ever since, even as recently as this year, when Square Enix released the Final Fantasy IX 25th anniversary vinyl called Timeless Tale. When Final Fantasy was introduced to North Americans in 1990, it was met with positive reviews. However, at the time, home console RPGs were still quite niche in the region, and unlike in Japan, where new RPGs were some of the most anticipated games, in North America they remained niche until the release of Final Fantasy VII. Having made this breakthrough, Square began to take greater measures to press their advantage overseas. This saw them hosting promotional activities exclusive to the region, such as the Toyota Echo giveaway around the release of Final Fantasy VIII. For Final Fantasy IX, Square went the extra mile, hosting 2 promotional events. First was the Final Fantasy IX Consumer Demo Day on the 8th of October. And then, a month later, on the 13th of November, attendees could purchase a copy of the game a day earlier than its official North American release date at a separate event. Both of these were hosted in San Francisco at the PlayStation Store in the Metreon Shopping Center, and the turnout, as you can expect, was incredible. Those who were there for the pre-launch sale also had the chance to take part in a unique game where they had to guess how many VV plushies were stuffed inside a Volkswagen Beetle, which was endearingly dubbed the VV-mobile. That then makes for a glorious segue, as the Beetle was known as the Bug in North America, and bugs are something found in the majority of games, including older Final Fantasy games. With regards to Final Fantasy IX, one of the most infamous bugs relates to Steiner, and to a lesser extent Beatrix, and it was known as the Thunderslash glitch. Thunderslash could be learnt by Steiner from the Defender and Ragnarok weapons, but it was also a Seiken ability for Beatrix, usable when she joined as a guest party member. However, for some reason, its base accuracy was set to 0, and as a result, the attack would almost always miss. This was due to the move's effect code, which saw it function as a gravity spell. This classification meant the skill could not utilize the weapon's accuracy value, and therefore had to rely on its own accuracy value, which was 0%. There was one condition in which the ability could potentially hit though. If Steiner or Beatrix had level or magic stats that were higher than the target enemies, this could overcompensate, but even still the chances of the attack connecting were exceptionally poor. There are many theories as to how this bug came to be, but perhaps the most interesting aspect of all is that the glitch, to this day, has still never been patched, despite Final Fantasy IX having tons of re-releases over the years. Now, given the scope of Final Fantasy IX, it's perhaps not too surprising that these issues crept in, something emphasised by how the team went about creating a rich, immersive setting that felt alive and populated. They created literally hundreds of NPCs, and while the exact number is unknown, their sheer volume exceeded previous games substantially. But what made the NPCs in Final Fantasy IX more unique compared to previous or even subsequent titles was that the majority of them weren't just throwaways there to create an illusion. They each had individual names and designs. From more important NPCs like the Tantalus Troupe to more minor characters like Queen Stella and Grandma Pickle. By giving these NPCs their own individual names and identities, the developers were able to create a sense of depth and complexity. Players were able to talk to these characters, learn about their backgrounds and stories, and feel that they were exploring a living, breathing environment, which was essential for bringing about a sense of closeness to the game's world. Aoki later revealed that due to the job they'd done, he actually felt little differentiation between the main characters and the supporting NPCs, and felt impassioned to develop each of them fully upon seeing the story begin to unfold and come to life on screen. This saw the addition of even more named NPCs because they felt they added so much value when it came to emboldening the game's overall narrative. When taking into account the prominent themes of life and death in the game, it was important for these NPCs to exist, as while the denizens of Terra sought to keep their civilization alive through assimilating the planet of Gaia, players saw through their eyes why it was so crucial that Gaia had to be protected. Another prominent world-building aspect of Final Fantasy IX's narrative was time. Much of the events of the main game were rooted in a conflict between Gaia and Terra, both of which were worlds struggling to preserve their own civilizations. But while we did learn a lot about the shared past between these two worlds, much of Gaia's history pre-Terra was left unknown. There was one location that gave some insight into the world's past though, and that location was Chocobo's Paradise. Positioned as an optional location, Chocobo's Paradise was accessible after getting the Sky upgrade for Choco. The location, as indicated by its name, was quite literally a paradise, with grand architecture and bountiful land, all inhabited peacefully by Chocobos under the rule of the Fat Chocobo. While much of the location was shrouded in mystery, we learnt by speaking to one of the local Chocobos that the paradise existed long before the disaster between Terra and Gaia manifested, meaning Chocobo's Paradise was well over 5,000 years old, and this marked it as one of the oldest known places in Gaia. What's more, this also meant Chocobo's Paradise had survived the cataclysm of Terra, which may have been due to the obscurity of the location. It's also unknown whether or not Chocobo's Paradise had always been solely inhabited by Chocobos. For example, in-game dialogue suggested that the famous traveller Ibsen had made his way there and taught the Chocobos how to play Tetra Master. Sticking with the subject of Tetra Master, after the huge success that was Triple Triad, the developers working on Final Fantasy IX felt it would be rather prudent to create a similar type of experience again. But they didn't want it to be too similar. It meant a new card game was created based around collecting cards, and each card had different levels of power. But that's where the similarities ended. What became known as Tetra Master was conceived by Ito. He came up with a system that was much more complex than Triple Triad, both in terms of depth, but also its practical application. It saw each card have its own power, class, and defensive stats, with it possible for some of them to even be upgraded. And because of this, Tetra Master had a stronger focus on mathematics than its predecessor. Tetra Master also formalized collecting, but this too wasn't a one-dimensional affair. Instead, players had a collector level that was determined by the quantity of cards they possessed, but also the variety of arrow patterns featured on said cards in their possession and their battle classes. It meant anyone who wanted to achieve the higher ranks needed to invest a serious amount of time, as not only did they need to collect every card, but those cards also needed to be upgraded to a suitable level. If you attained a point total of 1,698, the game granted the title of Master. But should the point tally of 1,700 be achieved due to a glitch with the game's programming, instead of granting players an even more impressive title, which was apparently meant to be the Collector, they were instead greeted with a message that simply said, "Would you like to discard the card?" Shifting away from mathematics to focus more on the arts, it's time to look at the deep connections between Final Fantasy IX, theatre, and Shakespearean motifs. Shakespeare has often been the inspiration for numerous creative works within the sphere of media. But with regards to Final Fantasy IX stands out here. From character names to story elements, allusions could be seen throughout the game. Some examples included the Tantalus Theatre Troupe and the Prima Vista Theatre Ship, but characters like Marcus, Cinna, and Puck were inspired names, as were the Black Waltzes. Additionally, the classic motif of star-crossed lovers was also seen in the relationship between Garnet and Zidane. Ito expressed that the exaggerated body language coupled with the character's shorter proportions also matched well with the motifs of theatre and stage. And this was perhaps best embodied by "I Want to Be Your Canary." Said to have been written by Lord Avon, a nod to William Shakespeare's birthplace, the play made several references to classic works like King Lear and Romeo and Juliet, the latter of which it roughly seemed to be based on. In terms of the player's role within the game though, the sequencing was quite interesting. The game began with a performance of the play, but abruptly concluded due to the commotion surrounding the kidnapping of Garnet. It wasn't until the game's ending that we saw the play once again performed, but this time it concluded with Zidane and Garnet's reunion, which could have been seen as the play coming full circle. I Want to Be Your Canary also featured plenty of improvisation, something that perhaps symbolised their ability to break away from their designated roles and essentially choose how they wanted to live. That then brings us on to our final piece though, which relates to the Final Fantasy IX remake, and no, not that Final Fantasy IX remake, the one before. Back in 2001, just over 6 months after Final Fantasy IX had been released in Japan, and before the game had even been shipped in Europe, Square announced that they were working on a trilogy of remakes. Due to their combined success on the PlayStation, it saw them announce ambitions to create full-on remakes of Final Fantasy VII, 8, and 9 for the PlayStation 2, with each game being reworked to take advantage of the additional space offered by the DVD format, something that was going to bring about both graphical and audio enhancements. To many, this announcement was completely out of left field, not least because the games weren't even that old. But it wasn't an uncommon approach. Final Fantasy IV, V, and VI were all re-released on the PlayStation between 1997 and 1999, as Square sought to make them available on newer systems, something that was crucial for those who were only just getting into the franchise following its explosion in popularity following the release of Final Fantasy VII. The strange aspect here, though, was that Square never made reference to the project again after its announcement. And after the merger with Enix, the trio of games were collectively cancelled and swept under the proverbial carpet. All we can do is speculate as to why this was, but the financial perils Square faced following the huge amount of capital invested in the Spirits Within may well have had a part to play. And with that, they were some fun facts about Final Fantasy IX that you never knew you needed. Be sure to let us know in the comments below which you found to be the most interesting, and if you enjoyed the video, feel free to hit that like button and subscribe for more. Also, if you're interested, check out our new channel, Datalog. Right everyone, with that, this is Daryl signing out. As always, I'd like to give a big thank you to all of our Patreon and YouTube membership supporters, especially Benjamin Snow, Christopher Gardner, Clever Chavez, EXP Required on YouTube, Frederick Forrest, Gregory and Stephen, who are super special Onion Eye supporters, and of course, a big thank you to everyone for watching this video. I'll see you all again soon for more Final Fantasy goodness.